Welcome to Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Earlier this week, PNB, the country's largest fund, or unit trust fund, has announced their 2019 annual report. And they took also the time to actually explain their forward-looking measures, including one that is called Focus 4. We'll get to that Focus 4 in a bit. I just want to examine a little bit more about what it means for PNB to perform in this year, because last year, according to the PNB chairman, Tan Sri Zeti Akhtar Aziz, it wasn't a kind year for them, and it was reflected in ASB's returns, where it was still hovering at that 5-point-something range instead of that lofty 7-point-something range or 8-point-something range. And 2019 is much ado about the local markets. So that's why PNB is actually trying to drive more international investments moving forward. So let's talk about the group president and CEO, the new one, Jalil Abdul Rashid, and his grand plan to pursue investments overseas. They want to do this via what they call Focus 4. And if I can just pull up this particular graphic. One item, the first item, is actually talking about the diversification of the fund. And what they mean by diversification is, of course, not just to go into the various markets that they want to enter, not just developed markets, but also emerging markets. For the longest of time, my conversation with a few fund managers over the past few days after the announcement of PNB, these fund managers are actually quite skeptical into how PNB might go into emerging markets in a very serious tone. We've known for a long time now that PNB is actually quite comfortable with the developed markets, including that of the United States. But for emerging markets, places like Africa, for instance, or places like the backyard of China, for instance, these areas PNB has not yet looked into. So it's a pro and con here. Number one, they're unfamiliar with the markets, but number two, this is an untapped market, the exact markets that Jalil Abdul Rashid actually says that he wants to pursue. So a lot of things can be done for this year. I hope PNB can actually do more in terms of diversifying the portfolio predominantly into emerging markets. But it's not just about equities, it's also about the ability for them to invest in real estate. So I hope when they think about diversifying their portfolios, it goes into these kind of classes as well, or asset classes as well. One thing to note, Jalil did say that for corporate Malaysia, and if I can just pull up this particular graphic here, there's two tables I want to show. The first one talks about some of the heavier investments that they're doing, including that of Maybank, Sapura, Velesto. These companies might take a big impact this year. Maybank, because there's a 6-month moratorium, interest rates have been cut low to 50 bips to 2.0, with some analysts saying that it might go even further. And of course, Velesto and Sapura are going through a very problematic time in terms of their oil and gas business. And Sapura, in fact, for instance, have taken a pay cut, 50% pay cut for senior management, here signaling the fact that Sapura needs to do a lot more in terms of reining in their business, particularly their costs, and more importantly, their fixed costs. So these are the kind of things that might take an impact in terms of corporate earnings this year, and therefore dividend income for PNB might be affected as well. The second table shows some strategic investments that I can pull up right now. The second table, it talks about the big idea of how PNB has to really think on managing the investments into all these kind of corporates moving forward. So both these tables basically show that PNB basically owns Bursa Malaysia. They are very heavily invested there. In fact, for the first time, this fund has exceeded the 300 billion ringgit fund size. The AUM right now stands at 312 billion based on last year's December 31st, 2019 figures. And of course, as we stand right now in mid-May, that number perhaps have gone up even further. So they really need to not just think about going local, they want to go international. And they've even set targets until 2022, that means 3 years from now, or 2.5 years to go. They want to grow whatever size that they're in right now to 30% international holdings. I, for one, heavily applaud this. Again, I tweeted this before, I want to reiterate this. I have been arguing, together with my colleagues over at BFM before this, that PNB really needs to diversify their international investments. And not just PNB, EPF even, Co-op, all these kind of fund managers, these billion ringgit fund managers and fund owners, they really have to start diversifying their market, not just locally, but internationally as well. And within that international ambit, not just developed markets, but EM as well, the emerging markets as well. This is something that is commendable. This is something that needs to be done. Of course, finally, I want to pull up that particular graphic that talks about the other 3 things in focus 4. And this graphic shows the value creation, risk management, organizational transformation. And when I had that conversation with Jalil a few months ago, back when Jalil invited some of the key editors over for lunch, he was actually emphasizing the 4th thing, which is the reorganization of his company and focusing on organizational transformation. Because at the end of the day, he doesn't intend to stay there in PNB forever. No one should stay in any company forever. But what he intends to do is to institutionalize the reforms that he can possibly bring forward for PNB. PNB is a good company, but PNB is an old company. PNB is a fantastic company to actually invest in many other corporations in Malaysia, as well as some of the equities overseas. So PNB is poised to take on strategic investments there. But if you do not institutionalize the kind of thinking and structure that is needed for PNB to move forward, it's going to be problematic for us, the people of Malaysia, where our money, my money is inside ASB, my wife's money is inside ASB, and we are going to get the hit eventually in the long run. So if we want to be long-term investors inside PNB, PNB also has to think long-term in terms of organizational structure and organizational reform and institutionalizing these kind of reforms. So yes, Focus 4 is a big deal for PNB and therefore a big deal for corporate Malaysia and therefore a big deal for Malaysia. I really hope and wish them all the best. I'm pretty sure Tan Sri Zeti and Jalil are there having good stewardship and clear on what they need to do and is absolutely crystal clear on the mandate that needs to be done, and therefore I guess they can get the job done. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit more about corporate Malaysia. The company I want to zoom in is on Nestle. Don't go anywhere.